There's some switches that can't be turned off once flipped, things that can't be unseen. These experiences happen in all parts of life, including how we view art. For me, that defining moment in art was the white phosphorus attack in Jaeger Development's 2012 shooter, Spec Ops: The Line. But I want to pace myself a bit. Before diving into that defining moment, we need to talk about the game and context that surrounds it. When I was in 8th grade, the game everyone wanted for Christmas was Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2. It was innocuous enough. We had hundreds of hours of fun playing multiplayer in Call of Duty 4 Modern Warfare and Call of Duty World at War's and Nazi Zombies in the various basements of various friends' houses. Whether the story or multiplayer, the gameplay and aesthetics of these shooters was the definition of cool and mature to my 14-year-old self. The gameplay provided escapism from the peaceful drudgery of middle school, and unbeknownst to me, these games had firmly entrenched my nascent pro-war attitude and blind American nationalism. It wasn't just that war was necessary, but that America warring with the world was cool and badass. This is what I was craving at the time. I wanted war and military shooters that offered the facade of realism in their gameplay. I wanted to vicariously experience war, an act of mass violence that had been polished and sold as something flashy and cool in the post-9/11 era. After sinking away multiple playthroughs in Brothers in Arms' Hell's Highway, a tactical World War II shooter, the new and flashy Call of Duty Black Ops and Modern Warfare 3 seemed stodgy and unimpressive. I wanted the ripped-out-of-headline setting of Modern Warfare, but the more thoughtful gameplay loop of Brothers in Arms. I wanted the new, cool war, where everything's advanced and characters aren't all up in their feelings. That's where Spec Ops: The Line came in, a tactical shooter that services the same modern military high fantasy gameplay of Modern Warfare. I got the game on my 16th birthday. It made for, well, a very formative 16th birthday. I wanted tactics, explosions, massive body counts, and the feel-good action of militarism. On its surface, Spec Ops offered all this, but I wasn't prepared for how it delivers on these desires. Climactic showdowns are transformed into PTSD meltdowns and hallucinations. Final twists are deeply personal nightmares. Set pieces of bombing raids become this. Something is malfunctioning. The baseline assumption is that video games are supposed to be fun. I'm not here to defend this idea, nor am I going to rattle off the great many games that disprove this. Of course, art doesn't have to be pleasant or comforting. While Spec Ops: The Line is part of that conversation, it isn't the most interesting question that the game asks. Spec Ops: The Line pushes the player to consider if fun in video games can be unethical, specifically the adrenaline-pumping fun of Modern Warfare, and how the ethics of fun are pushed by gameplay and aesthetics. Spec Ops is not only a response to the sadism of jingoistic action games, but also to the common arguments that use escapism as both a description and an excuse. Here's a debrief. Let's pick a game at random. Fire Emblem on the Game Boy Advance. On paper, there are horrendous things in this game. You are leading an army through war that employs child soldiers. As a literal description, the use of child soldiers in the game is horrifying, but the aesthetics of the game make no allusions towards realism. The graphics are cartoony, there's no blood and guts, the setting is a fantasy land with fire and dragons. Even the live-action commercial is camp.
No man can be trusted. What happened to Dorka?
The game is fun, but would it be fun if the designs were changed to be realistic, with blood and guts in a setting that is more approximate to the real world? Would it even be ethical for such a game to attempt to be fun? Most people, I imagine, wouldn't find a realistic child soldier simulator fun. Such a game is so obviously extreme that it would take a specific kind of sicko to find it fun. But what happens when it's a game like Call of Duty Modern Warfare or Brothers in Arms Hell's Highway? The latter is couched in history, and the former is in a sprawling era of post-9/11 propaganda and pro-war fervor. The question about taking actual historical atrocities and making them fun is its own can of worms, but we'll shelve that and instead focus on the specific aesthetic created by Call of Duty 4. By having sets and weapons that are close enough approximations to reality and a story that alludes to the real-world intrigue of the Cold War and War on Terror, the game firmly plants itself as a high fantasy version of, as the title puts it, modern warfare. Is it okay to co-opt a real-life war that is actively killing millions of people and making it just off enough in terms of realism to make it fun? As Spec Ops: The Line demonstrates, it is not. Such a game not only turns war into a hero fantasy, but also transforms war from an unpredictable and often manufactured tragedy into righteous violence that is both marketable and desirable. The true genius of Spec Ops: The Line isn't the PTSD nightmares, the shocking set pieces, its subversive story, or even the subtle intricacies of loading screens and the executions. The real genius is how Spec Ops binds these elements together. Like a nasty egg in a hamburger, Spec Ops utilizes some of the shittiest, most boring shooting mechanics to bind itself together. Most action sequences go through the motions of hide behind cover, play whack-a-mole with the enemies, point at an enemy you want your squad mates to kill, wait to recover your HP, collect ammo, and jump to the next bit of cover. Extremely basic on-rail sections break up the flow, but none of it is very involved. While simple isn't bad, the gameplay of Spec Ops is rote, with absolutely no creativity or original thought. Many reviewers in 2012 gave Spec Ops middling scores at its release for this very reason. Many would say some variation of, the story is great, but the gameplay leaves something to be desired. This train of thought even soured some of the game's more positive reviews. This shows the folly of itemized reviews that segment off graphics, gameplay, multiplayer, and story into their own boxes, but also that, more than any other comparable mainstream release, Spec Ops has a deeper understanding of the emotional effect of gameplay. Fun gameplay can act as a kind of buffer between the player and the content of a game. The more fun and more mechanically rich a game is, the easier it is to be consumed in the gameplay above all else. Pikmin, Pokemon, Call of Duty. These are all games with enough mechanical depth and fun that it's easy to ignore the deeper implications of their gameplay and story because the fun itself can become the beginning and end of the experience. By having no such depth, Spec Ops places a singular focus on the meaning of player actions. A slow-motion decapitation isn't positive feedback for a plan well done, but a quick reminder to the player that this is the carnage you are exacting on human bodies. By the time Spec Ops reaches its yellow Pikmin moment, the moment where a game's simple mechanics would normally expand, the game opts to begin subverting its story by changing the target of player fire from faceless Arabs to US soldiers, as well as adding civilians into the crossfire. As the game goes on, rather than the gameplay expanding, the implications of the gameplay are laid progressively more bare. When the player issues orders through the eyes of Captain Martin Walker, the commands go from clinical and professional at the beginning to violent and chaotic by the end.
Long-range target! Put him down!
I need him dead!
The executions that the player can use to kill dying enemies go from quick to drawn out and animalistic. These progressions don't make the actions more barbaric. Instead, they rip the veneer of professionalism and acceptability off of the brutality. More complicated mechanics tend to cover up the brutality of what the player is experiencing. Brothers in Arms: Hell's Highway tells an emotionally rich and character-driven story, but it's easy for it to fade into the background. The player has many tools and is constantly making tactical decisions. Place bazooka teams here, put machine guns there. It's all very thoughtful relative to other military shooters. The loop of make plan, execute plan is satisfying, but it's so easy to get lost in it that it obscures the emotional beats of the story during the moment-to-moment gameplay. The tactics elements in Spec Ops are insultingly simple by comparison. The tactics are no more complicated than point squad towards enemy, squad kills enemy. You can't even issue separate orders for your two squad members. This tactical simplicity is emblematic of how Spec Ops is constructed. It never gets more complicated than its first half hour. It leaves the most base elements of military shooter gameplay to rot in the sun. This game is a critique of an industry's use of war as a place for escapism and heroism. To craft rich and intricate mechanics would make this critique hypocritical. While it is the most spectacular part of Spec Ops' design, the use of rote gameplay, story beats, and characters as a starting point is what makes it such a tough sell. The game begins with bombastic in medias res. After mowing down half a dozen helicopters, the game cuts to its chronological beginning. The player is introduced to a generic trio of soldiers, a commander with no personality, a wisecracking frat boy, and the no-nonsense explosives expert. This is a rescue mission in Dubai after the city has been thrashed by an eternal sandstorm. Soon, the player finds that locals are fighting back against the US Army and, in response, starts killing countless Dubai natives in a generic bloodbath of America good, poor brown foreigner bad. All of this is a lie. Spec Ops is using its narrative and gameplay forms as a way to lull players into a space of safe familiarity as it slowly tears away at the modern military shooter genre. Even the achievements do this. The game has active counters telling you how close you are to killing 100 enemies with handguns, 350 with rifles, 75 with shotguns, etc., etc., etc. Have you killed 4 people in under 10 seconds? Well, you should, because that's an achievement to be proud of. Anyone off-put by machismo, jingoism, and hoorah nationalism will likely abandon the game. Several people that I recommended the game to dropped it early on for this reason and only continued under pressure of my sweaty pleading. In my head, all I could think about is how the in medias res helicopter sequence sets up the game's temporal crunching.
Wait, this isn't right!
Well, it's too late now!
No, I mean, we did this already!
What do you mean?
Fuck it! It's not that just...
The first object the player sees in Dubai is a stop sign, followed by a short rappel that sets in motion the game's recurring idea of descent as the player keeps tumbling downwards, further and further downwards, and possibly downwards throughout the game. The game will criticize the idea that violence is inevitable and there is no choice. The rush of mindless violence and killing is because Captain Walker wants to be a hero and, as he and many other impressionable people learned from other shooters, violence is heroism. This is all well and good and cool and whatnot, but the double fake is so convincing that these qualities aren't noticeable until a second playthrough. While many people may feel the game is off and uncomfortable in its early hours, it isn't until a scene halfway through the game that players begin to understand what Spec Ops is doing. This scene is like being buried by a pile driver. Captain Walker, faced by a horde of American soldiers that he wants to kill, decides the only way to advance is to use white phosphorus. Reminiscent of the Death from Above mission in Call of Duty 4, the player robotically picks off all the tiny dots on the targeting system with brutal chemical weapons. After this short burst of brain-dead gameplay, the separation between Spec Ops and other military shooters begins to emerge for many players.
Stop talking.
What you just say? It means the smoke is toxic. Keep your mouth shut.
Yeah. Let's just keep moving.
Oh no.
Yeah, it is. That's why Gould stormed this place. He didn't want the gate.
He was trying to rescue his people. This is your fault, goddammit! Stop right there, Lugo. But it is! He wouldn't listen to my choice! He turned us into fucking killers! That's enough, Sergeant! No! No! I told him to! No!
We need
The player is confronted with two things: the dying soldiers they consciously attacked, and the civilians they unknowingly slaughtered. While other military shooters cover their tracks and shuttle the player onto the next level, Spec Ops makes the player walk through and look at both the intended and unintended consequences of their actions. To see how this specifically differs from other military shooters, let's look at another comparable scene. This is Little Resistance, the second mission of Call of Duty World at War. For what it's worth, and it probably isn't worth much, World at War is the best Call of Duty game, and we see some of its artistic clarity here in Little Resistance. While the player is riding the transport ship, the music swells in heroic triumph as American bombers fly overhead.
Navy's been bombing the hell out of the island for 2 days straight. Miller, we hit any resistance on the beach? You get on that radio and call for immediate missile support.
Don't think twice.
Roma, I want you up the beach and at that tree line ASAP. You're on point as we move in. I got it.
What the hell? Is that one of ours?
Everything goes wrong. The music goes silent before fading back in as a frenzied mess, complete with a choir and all the works.
Hang in there, kid. We need to get off this thing.
That bombastic music and the simple plans from your commander become a mess of gunfire, explosions, screaming, ad-libbed orders, and the ghostly howls from cruiser loudspeakers. After the player calls in a missile strike, you have to walk through the rubble to see the dying Japanese soldiers left. Quickly, that horrifying sight is drowned out by the hectic firefight that breaks out at the next line of defenses. This whole section is comparable to the white phosphorus sequence in Spec Ops, at least in its immediate surface elements. Heroism, running interference for brutality, coming face to face with the realities of long-range warfare. The problem is that no matter how much this landing sequence rattles the characters, these experiences have no lasting impact on the game. Later, in the same level, the player picks up a flamethrower and gets this music cue.
Those MCs, don't let up! Hell yeah!
It's as if we're playing Doom or Wolfenstein, except it's in the real World War II where you're butchering real people. This is the exact opposite of Spec Ops White Phosphorus. This sequence has a corrupting effect on the rest of the game. From this moment onwards, players will be tuned in much more strongly to the degradation of Captain Walker's mental state and the subversive changes that are occurring to the game. Sometimes, enemy encounters become this.
What the fuck? Shit! Are you kidding me? I don't need this shit right now. Hey, still, goddamn.
Walker, hurry up!
When Captain Walker respawns after death, it looks as if he's waking from a PTSD hallucination. Even the loading screens become antagonistic plays on the bro philosophy quotes in Call of Duty. Yeah, Colin Powell quotes really make me feel the struggle, but Spec Ops is telling me that it is all my fault and that the dead characters have it lucky since they won't have to live with PTSD. In opposition to this, many players have responded to the white phosphorus scene by saying it's unfair and mean of the game to force the player to do something and then make them feel bad for having done it. And this is true. The game does not give the player a choice, and almost all players are going to feel terrible. But what this scene is doing isn't merely the guilt trip that it may at first seem. The game is dragging attention towards the vicarious relationship that players have with their in-game avatars, in this case Captain Walker. The general reception to most modern military shooters shows that players are usually okay with acting out the fantasy of violence in a modern war setting, as long as they don't have to truly consider it. Spec Ops grabs us like a dog and shoves our noses in it. Conditioned from other shooters, the player, like Captain Walker, will treat violence as a first recourse, and it's no surprise either. Listen to how the AC-130 operator reacts to exploding people's entire bodies.
Yeah, good kill. I see lots of little pieces down there.
While it may seem initially unfair for the player to feel guilty about actions they had no say in, The game has many other atrocities that the player can commit without direct prompting. Many players may shoot at this group of civilians because of the provocations of the previous scene and still having standard shooter instincts. There's no need to kill these civilians, but revenge and the ubiquity of violence are powerful influences. I've been vague throughout this video about much of Spec Ops. There have been numerous details and specifics that I've trimmed out or removed. Partly, it's because I want the game to speak for itself, but it's also because I wanted to focus as closely as possible on how the gameplay of Spec Ops is built without getting lost in the minutiae of its story. After all, it was the gameplay that shook me to the core on that nasty, raining, weeknight 16th birthday. Until my most recent set of playthroughs, I couldn't even offer a cogent plot summary of Spec Ops. It was the gameplay and its stripped down, cruel simplicity that flipped that irreversible switch inside of me. After playing Spec Ops The Line, there was no going back to most military shooters. I could no longer stomach the idea of using ongoing wars as a source of escapism and fun, nor could I continue the brain-dead worship of militarism in all its carnage. It's a game that wore down the buffer that I'm able to have between the fun of a game and the content of its story and aesthetic design. Fun and escapism are wonderful and necessary, but not to cruel and inhumane ends.
No matter what happens next, don't be too hard on yourself. Even now, for all you've done, you can still go home. Lucky you.